Welcome to Lecture 2 for Worship Foundations. Once again, I want to thank my retired colleague, Dr. Susan Wilhock, who graciously shared with me the structure of this course as she taught it in the past. I have continued to adapt her work over these past few years. However, in the spirit of transparency and academic integrity, I want to recognize the tremendous influence her work has had on this lecture and the topics she thought important to share. I hope you figured out that my lectures are meant to go along with and connect at certain points with the readings and the supplementary content I post to Brightspace. There is just so much we could cover and talk about in this course that it's hard to limit what I want to raise up in the lecture and offer as things to look at and think about in the other content I post. It's crucial to do the readings for the course to benefit fully. You will also discover that sometimes the readings will overlap and may be somewhat broader than the topic for a given learning module. Something that you read this week, for example, much of Chapter 4 in Susan White's book, may also influence how you think about things in another learning module. But the section on daily prayer is very pertinent for this model. Some learning modules have more readings than others. If it seems like a lot, break it up and go back and read more closely if you need to. Then post on the discussion board a question, concept, or reflect on something from the lecture and respond to others. I want to see dialogue and conversation on the discussion board. Remember that your original post needs to be created in the first week of the module, so no later than January 29th this time around. It is impossible to replicate an in-class discussion, but this is an attempt to bring in content and deepen understanding from all our perspectives as we study this phenomenon called worship. We have a lot to learn from each other, and the perspectives we bring from our own experience and the insights garnered from the readings is tremendously important. So, taking off from last week, humans have always had rituals to assist in the smooth flow of life. They give us guidance around what to say and do, especially in specific situations. They comfort and form and transform us. Many times, rituals take place in sacred or holy space. Or maybe space is made sacred by the rituals we share there. From ritual theory, we learn that people have a need to construct rites. But we also may have a suspicion of ritual, for ritual's sake can seem nonsensical, especially if we don't understand the reasoning. Some of you may know what I mean when I talk about the ritual police in a congregation, those who are always eager to point out that you did not do that quite right. For example, there have been more than one congregation torn apart over the right way to celebrate communion. The formation of the United Church of Canada in 1925 brought together Presbyterians and Methodists who celebrated communion in very different ways. So, in this denomination, should communion be served in the pews, or should people come forward? Individual cups or a common cup? We'll talk more about that later in the term. It's sometimes been said that the 7 last words of the church are, "We never did it that way before." Ruth Duck quotes these words in her opening chapter as the often response in the church to something new. Rituals, by their nature, are repetitive, and repetition can be soothing. comforting and healing, and it's certainly one of the reasons some people don't like change. Think of everyday rituals. What are some? Planning and preparing meals, a morning shower, an evening bath, walking the dog, a football player's victory dance. One of the things I find most difficult since my husband died is the loss of the seemingly insignificant rituals we shared. I miss having my coffee brought to me in bed and him asking me, "What's the plan for the day?" I miss the shared glass of wine at the end of the day and the chance to talk as we made supper. Sometimes rituals become rather superstitious. A sense that if you do the same thing again that you did before, you'll have the same outcome. Wearing a lucky shirt, or the tourist ritual of kissing the Blarney Stone. The church has always had rituals or rites for certain things. The weekly cycle moving from Sabbath to Sabbath with its particular rituals, and the yearly cycle of feasts and seasons. Worship is grounded in or composed of rituals, and many of those rituals are linked to time and space, to the weekly and yearly calendar. Worship as ritual is one of the 5 different theological emphases that Ruth Duck outlines for understanding worship. In addition, she explores worship as revelation, worship as response to God, worship as relationship, worship as rehearsal. As you think about this section of the text, where would you place your personal emphasis? How do you see these understandings being embodied in your own congregation and denomination? When you think about worship, what element is essential for you? What would you not give up, where you don't feel like you've worshiped if this is not present? For some, it might be a particular prayer. For others, it is the reading of Scripture. For some traditions, music is not essential. But for me, music and art are a must. I love to sing in worship. For some traditions, the Eucharist is essential every time. For others, not. As spoken about in the last lecture, there is an overall pattern to worship called the ordo. The pattern may not be the same every time for everyone, but there is a common thread, and there are common roots going back to the beginning of the church and its roots in the Jewish calendar. This is our ecumenical nature. From the Greek word oikumene, that means the whole world or the whole household of God. There are lots of differences between us, but there are things that we share and that bind us together and to God. The ecumenical movement is a quest for the underlying organic unity of Christianity. Atlantic School of Theology, formed 50 years ago, came into being because of the strong belief in ecumenism championed by the leaders of the Roman Catholic, Anglican, and United Church of Canada in Halifax at the time. AST is Canada's only fully integrated ecumenical school of theology. And part of our mission is to foster understanding among communities of faith. And of course, beyond ecumenical dialogue, there is interfaith dialogue, which is also so important. How do we engage in respectful dialogue and learn from other faith or spiritual traditions. Your worship immersion assignment is designed to help you think about things like that. The great schisms tore Christians apart, and the ecumenical movement, which can be traced from the late 19th century, has been trying to bring us back together. Many would point to the world missionary conferences that were held at that time to begin the quest for unity, with mergers, unions, full recognition. The World Council of Churches produced the BEM document in 1982, Baptism, Eucharist, and Ministry. That document stresses what we hold in common. We'll come back to that later in the course, and maybe I'll tell you a bit about my experience attending a portion of the World Council of Churches' 6th Assembly in Vancouver when I was still a student. It was truly a life-changing experience. But this week, we are focused on some aspects of time and space as it relates to worship, because worship is very much related to and guided by time. God comes to us in time and history. I've posted a link that talks about the ancient Celtic understanding of time and space. And when our guest, the Reverend Ivan Gregan, comes to our class on January 30th, Ivan will be moving us forward in time from this ancient understanding to look at the Celtic influence on Christianity and some specific aspects of Celtic theology. The Christian faith is teleological. It is future-oriented, leading to something, leading to that eschatological hope in the promises of God. So, in the peculiarity of time, God is revealed. But God is both beyond time and also dwells in time, including our time. Worship follows the rhythms of life and the movements of the sun, praying at various times of the day, or, for example, the Korean church practice of dawn prayer, getting up at dawn and going to church to pray. I expect you know the distinction coming from the Greek understanding of chronos time. It's now 10 a.m. in Halifax. Of course, it's only 6 a.m. for Philip on the West Coast. And kairos time, the right sense of time, the fullness of time, the feeling of the right time that God is about to do a new thing. You may be familiar with the organization called Kairos, an ecumenical organization of 10 churches and religious organizations working together on important justice issues. Both chronos and kairos are important in worship. The distinction was advanced by St. Augustine. In Book 11 of the Confessions, his kind of autobiography, the story of his life and conversion, Augustine rejects the linear concept of time that had the 3 divisions of time as past, present, and future, thinking of those as separate. He asserted that they are really 3 aspects of the same reality in a Trinitarian relationship. He wrote, "All past is driven back by the future. All the future is consequent on the past, and all past and future are created and take their course from that which is ever present." A person's faith is tied up with the past, so the past is always present to us, a part of us. In the present, our past is contained. We are never without a past, even in the case of memory loss or dementia. The future is not yet, but is already forming in our lives. We all probably know that in the experience of boredom, time stretches out and seems like an infinity. Yet, at the experience of excitement and passion doing something we love, we lose all track of time and hours pass by like moments. Well, they are the same on the clock, but they really are experienced in quite different ways. One of the reasons that it is so hard for us to conceive of sacred time is because culture makes all time the same. Time is forgotten. Stores are open 24/7, and every day can feel the same. We can feel like we can never stop working. This view makes time a commodity, and we run out of it. But really, we have all the time in the world. We have all the time there is. This does not mean that we don't have deadlines. We do that to mark time, to use it well. But we live in time, not against time. The use of a calendar is a way that we mark time or progress through time. There are different calendars. Our year starts a new calendar in January. The academic calendar for AST starts with summer term in June. The public school calendar begins in September. And the church calendar here starts in late November with Advent. The beginning of the Christian calendar has its roots in the Jewish calendar. As Justo and Catherine Gonzalez write in the book Worship in the Early Church, one of the main elements binding Jews together, even as they were scattered throughout the Roman Empire and beyond, was the calendar. From one extreme to the other of their vast dispersion, Jews could express and experience their unity by sharing a single calendar with similar activities. Every day began at sundown, and the center of the Jewish calendar was the 7-day week, culminating on the Sabbath with its specific observances and celebrations. We know from reading the Gospels that Jesus often collided with synagogue leaders about what was permissible to do on the Sabbath. Sabbath worship at the time of Jesus certainly included practices of sacrifice in the temple, and we know that people also gathered in the synagogues for worship. In the first century, Judeo-Christians continued to follow the Jewish calendar, and many continued to observe the Jewish Sabbath. However, because of the significance of the resurrection, which happened on the first day of the week, those first followers of Jesus felt a need to gather and celebrate the resurrection. So when the Jewish Sabbath ended on Saturday evening, they would join with other believers to break bread and study Scripture. As more Gentiles began to join the church, and after Christians were expelled from the synagogue, there was a transition from meeting after sunset to before sunrise on the first day of the week. Second-century writers such as Justin Martyr attest to the widespread practice of Sunday worship, and by 361 AD, it had become a mandated weekly occurrence. During the Middle Ages, Sunday worship was not only about the celebration of the resurrection, but became associated with Sabbath rest. Some traditions within the Christian realm, though, still retain Saturday as their worship day, notably Seventh-day Adventists. All the units of time, day, week, month, year, became a means to worship and witness. Times of feasting and fasting emerged. Within the year, seasons emerged, the earliest being the Pascha, or known as Easter, and what led up to the Passover and Holy Week. We tend to reenact salvation history through the calendar. The liturgy of time is enacted in the daily cycle of evening prayer, known as Vespers, and morning song as Matins, and the other hours of prayer. You have read or will read about the development of that. Liturgical calendars began to be developed around the 4th century, including the colors associated with various seasons. I'm posting a link to a couple of those, with the colors being vibrant symbols in the church. There are 2 cycles, the temporal cycle and the sanctoral cycle. The temporal cycle pivots on the festivals of Christmas and Easter. All Sundays, seasons, and festivals are related to these festivals. Because Easter varies in date each year based on the vernal equinox and the phases of the moon, it is called a movable feast. The sanctoral cycle is the fixed daily commemorations of individuals, of saints. In the West, this year begins with Advent in November, but that is not the case in Eastern Rite churches, in which the year begins in September. Liturgical revival in the Church's liturgical renewal movement started with Vatican II, but drifted into the Reformed and other traditions in the 70s and 80s. My tradition, the United Church of Canada, really did not have too much liturgy or recognize the full liturgical season until then. We already talked about Epiphany, January 6th feast day, commemorating the manifestation of Christ to the Gentiles in the persons of the Magi, also called Twelfth Night or King's Day. And the Sunday following Epiphany is called Baptism of Jesus, which is followed by something that we call ordinary time, with the color green for growth and life. This is time between the major seasons, probably coming from the word ordo, or ordered pattern. There is nothing ordinary about ordinary time. In it, we are celebrating the presence of the mystery of God in all things. Transfiguration Sunday is a feast day that commemorates the transformation of Jesus radiant in glory, as written in the Synoptic Gospels. I had the pleasure of being on Mount Tabor, the traditional site of the Transfiguration, in February of 2020 as we traveled through Israel and Palestine. I'm planning a return trip in February of 2023 if you're interested. The word beloved forms the bookends of the season of Epiphany. Jesus is named as beloved at his baptism, and once again named beloved at his transfiguration. Ash Wednesday marks the season of Lent, the 40-day period before Easter. And there is a very interesting transition that happens in the early Christian church that leads to that 40-day period. The Anglo-Saxon origins of the word mean spring, a time when food sources were low during planting, when harvest was not expected for some time. This fed into its development as a liturgical season in the Christian faith. It begins on Ash Wednesday. The day before is Shrove Tuesday or Mardi Gras, the feast before the fast. But it was also a day of penitence. To be shriven means one has confessed one's sins and has been forgiven. Certainly in my experience in the United Church growing up, Ash Wednesday was not acknowledged. I remember being told by my mother that Ash Wednesday was something that Roman Catholics did. I remember introducing an Ash Wednesday service in my first pastoral charge, and it was new to the people who participated, but they discovered the rich meaning in the ritual and the words. In Lent, we skip Sundays when we count the 40 days because Sundays commemorate the resurrection. It was a time for catechetical instruction for new converts. It was also thought to commemorate the 40 days of Jesus in the wilderness. It is a time of rededication, repentance, fasting, leading to Holy Week. The Easter Triduum consists of 3 days before Easter, including Maundy Thursday. Maundy Thursday is often a time of stripping of the altar, foot washing, tenebrae, extinguishing candles. Then Good Friday and Holy Saturday, including in some traditions, the Easter Vigil. Then there's the 50 days of Pentecost and another ordinary time. A recent addition to the liturgical calendar is the season of creation with the color orange. I've attached a link on Brightspace with more information about that season. In the southern hemisphere, where it originated, it ties nicely with spring and the sense of rebirth. In the northern hemisphere, the links are with harvest and Thanksgiving. And for the Eastern Church, it is the season which begins their church year. So there is a rhythm for our life together, and the worship service itself is marked by time, led by the presiders, some more closely guided by Chronos time, in other words, do not go longer than 1 hour, or in other traditions by Kairos time. Worship lasts until it seems right for it to end. Time and space themselves become diaphanous indications of the holy. They become symbols, sheer and light, almost completely transparent or translucent, ethereal. The holy place could be a shrine, a forest grove, temple, church, or other area of worship that is symbolically marked off as sacred ground. Exodus 3:15 says that when the Lord saw Moses was coming closer, he called from the middle of the bush and said, "Moses, Moses." And Moses answered, "Here I am." And God said, "Do not come any closer. Take off your sandals, because you are standing on holy ground." when the assembly gathers, we are gathered in sacred space, in holy time. We encounter God. I have posted a link to 19 sacred sites in the world which cross all different faith traditions. They are hauntingly beautiful. Place or space has deep theological meaning. But we have to be careful not to draw too much of a dichotomy between the secular and the sacred, the ordinary and the holy, because to do so may say that God does not enter life except in designated times and special places. We know that not to be true, and it would restrict God's activity. But at the same time, people have always, and in all cultures, sensed certain places to be sacred. The story of God's people acknowledges that we have always had a sense of where God dwells. The cloud, the Holy of Holies, and we claim that. But that is not to limit God to only there. We might ask, what does it take to create sacred space? Can we create it? Time and place both have surplus meaning. They mean more than they mean. They carry meaning beyond hands on a clock or brick and mortar. Both time and place are political. How we use time, the work week, the justice or injustice of that. How do we preserve and protect sacred places? How are these places accessible to all or not? Think of the Holy Lands and political claims. So look at the pictures and think of your own ideas of sacred space and sacred time, and maybe post a picture of a sacred place in the discussion board and let folks know about its meaning for you. There are lots more things we could talk about, but I'm going to stop here so you can get to work on learning Module 2. Remember, your worship immersion paper is due by February 20th, and you should be thinking about a topic for your final research paper. The end of March will come soon enough. I will be in Colorado for the Association of Theological Field Educators Conference this coming week, so I may not be as accessible as usual. But I look forward to seeing you on January 30th when we will welcome the Reverend Ivan Gregan to share some of his expansive knowledge on Celtic theology and how that impacts worship. And I look forward to reading the conversations that will emerge on the discussion board in these next 2 weeks.